And going into informality, according to Santiago Levy, is bad in the sense that reduces productivity, because going into informality means that instead of going to a job in the formal sector where you can be relatively productive, you go into informality, which is usually low productivity works, jobs. So, and that reduces the aggregate level of productivity in the economy. So, and whereas when you have these incentives, then you sort of incentivize low productivity economy in general. This is Santiago Levy's hypothesis. And then Gordon Hanson mentions a fourth factor, which is the China factor, which means that since China entered the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in the early 2000s, China has competed a lot with Mexico in a third market, and that third market is the US market. So since Chinese products are very much similar to what Mexico used to produce, so they are competing against each other in the US market. China has some competitive advantage because of the low wages and because of the low cost of transportation. And so the Chinese have displaced Mexican goods in the US market. And this is the four elements that he mentions. So just remember which are the elements that Gordon Hanson points out. Tim Kehoe, on the other hand, suggests the following. Suggests that there are inefficient financial institutions. But when he talks about inefficient financial institutions, he's not talking about the same thing as Gordon Hanson. This is important just to keep in mind. Because Gordon Hanson is pointing out that poorly functioning credit market means that there's no credit to the private sector. Whereas Kehoe, what he says is, yes, he accepts that there is no credit to the private sector, but what he says is that that's because the bankruptcy law and some other institutional arrangements are such that the banks do not have incentives to lend to the private sector. So he claims that just making these changes could help a lot. And then he emphasizes the role of the rule of law, which is considered to be insufficient. And a bad rule of law is not good because then this incentivizes investment in general. That's why it's important. He also claims that there are rigidities in the labor market, which means that it's very costly to hire or fire labor in the economy, and therefore people decide, the businessmen decide just not to hire or fire in order not to have to fire people later on in a bad cycle of the economy. And four, he mentions falling public investment and problems in the financial system, which is a little bit related to what Hanson was saying. But he also mentions this falling public investment. But he mentions that, he says, this has been argued, but he doesn't really endorse that view. He basically sticks to the first three elements. So as you see, there are now many explanations or alternative explanations. Credit markets, monopolies, informality, China factor, etc. Heckman and his students, what they argue is the following elements. Excessive regulation in labor markets, for example, so that there's a lot of regulation in those markets. High cost of enforcing contracts and law, which again, the reason why that's important is similar to the rule of law point that I made before, in the sense that if there are high costs of enforcing contracts and laws, there are no incentives to invest in some areas because then you might have some legal problems and then it's very hard to enforce those contracts. Third, is lack of competition and weak infrastructure. Again, in these sectors that were identified before, like energy, telecoms, financial services, and other goods. And fourth, poor quality of schooling. And they mentioned the PISA results in which Mexico, if you know about this, in all these PISA results, which is this standardized exam that the OECD applies to some countries, Mexico is always in the last in the list of countries that take these PISA exams. And they also discuss some other issues which I'm not going to get into this here. Well, I want to talk a little bit about something because this is interesting because Heckman criticizes the Levy's hypothesis that I mentioned. He says that doesn't make sense. Levy's hypothesis doesn't make sense because informality is not the consequence, it's not the cause, it's not the cause of low productivity, as Santiago Levy suggests. He said, what Heckman says is that's the consequence. I mean, people doesn't go into informality because there are incentives to go into informality. people go to informality because there are not enough jobs in informality, and therefore they have to resort to this informality market, and they end up earning lower wages in the informal sector as a result of not being enough jobs in the formal sector. So it's more a consequence rather than a cause of low productivity. So they are very critical of Santiago Levy's view, and that's why I mentioned this is important. This is a view, by the way, which I take. I have research on this area which sort of supports this argument. What I have done is to compare wages from people with similar skill levels in both the formal and informal sector. And what you observe is that people in the formal sector tend to earn less as in the informality than in the formality, meaning that they are actually having a cost by moving to the informal sector, which is more compatible with the view of a segmentation of the labor market in which people cannot get a job in the formal sector and therefore goes to the informal sector as a second best option. Because if Levy's view were right, you would see that people were getting like a benefit from moving into the informal sector. For example, like earning the same level of wage of gross income, but by not paying taxes, having a higher level of net income, for example. And that's not happening. So Santiago Levy's view is not compatible with what we observe in the economy. Okay. Then this is the view by Chiquier and Ramos Francia, which are these guys from the Central Bank in Mexico. They have all these diagrams suggesting what are those problems in Mexico. As you can see, that means, for example, what they have is a reinforcement process. They start with this inefficient institutional design, lack of competition, and market rigidities. They all lead to weak regulation and supervision, lack of innovation and investment, inefficient allocation of resources, and that leads to suboptimal human and physical infrastructure levels, high input prices, weak public finances. That reinforces this, but at the same time, all those produce low competitiveness, and in the end, that generates insufficient growth, low employment opportunities, and high inequality. So the problem with this, in general, I would say this is right. The problem with this is like everything is related to it's like everything is bad in Mexico, and that doesn't. I don't think that helps a lot to understand what's the main problem, because it means like it's just like everything is not working well in Mexico, or everything is related to everything, and that I don't think it helps a lot to understand. But then they mention a few examples, which is interesting because and it's interesting because that's the way in which discussion in Mexico takes place. These guys from the central bank say, for example, there are three problems. Financial sector, for example. There's lack of competition in the financial sector, and they go into great detail to explain why there is lack of competition in the financial sector. But in the end, they say, well, you know, that might be fine. I mean, that seems like to be a problem, but that's probably an outcome, which is what do we prefer? To have a oligopolistic sector in the financial sector with low credit to the private sector with no risk? I mean, we're not getting into this problem like in the US market, by lending to a lot of people that actually affected stability and was very risky. So they say, this is probably bad, but this is the best thing that we can get. And yeah, I think that's part of the problem, because then something that they clearly identify as a problem, they sort of discard it when they enter into discussion. What can we do about that? Because what they say, yeah, that's probably bad, but probably the alternative is worse, which I don't think that's the case. But I will get back to this later on. And then they say this second example that they discuss is the information and communication technology, and they discuss the problem with Telmex. I don't know if you know about this situation. Carlos Slim, which is the richest man in the world, basically, is the owner of the private monopoly in Mexico, which is Telmex, which used to be a public monopoly, was privatized, but was privatized without competition, so basically it was granted a monopoly. Now there is some competition, but he's like the dominant firm in the sector, and it charges very high rates, and it's very costly, because all this access to this information and communication technology in general in Mexico. So they mentioned this case as a problem in which the commission in charge of regulating that firm is basically unable to do it because it has been actually taken over by this firm, which is basically COFETEL, which is this commission in charge of regulating telecommunications in Mexico, has no enforcement capabilities so far, not against at least Telmex, which is the biggest firm in Mexico in this area. And the third one is electricity, which, as I said before, is a public sector monopoly, and which is costly again. It's very inefficient in general, and it's very low productivity, and that increases that. And electricity is important because that's an input for any business in Mexico, for most businesses in Mexico, and therefore that means that it's costly for all these firms, which therefore reduces competitiveness for all these firms in Mexico. So these are the products they identified, three very specific sectors. One, they say it's okay. Two others, which they identify as being related to monopolies in Mexico. And then what they say is the challenge is, a little bit surprisingly, to me at least, is they say the challenges and public policies are institutional change, and they say we need institutions supporting transparency and efficiency in public spending. I don't know what do you think about this, but this doesn't follow from any of this. This looks more like an ideological thing that they are trying to put into the agenda, which doesn't really is related to any of these things. The second point, challenge in public policies is competition policy, and this one clearly makes sense because of what they were discussing here, which is like strengthen the antitrust commission in Mexico, giving the budgetary autonomy and increase penalties and so on, which is something which makes sense given what I just said. So I like this conclusion. I don't like this one. And they say labor market, it needs to increase flexibility, which again doesn't follow from what their discussion. This again looks like pretty much like an ideological discussion. So now the thing is, which one of all these diagnostics are correct or relevant? And if you ask any Mexican economist, they have their own explanation, okay? Which is basically a mix of what I have just said. I mean, you think about all the likely explanations out there, probably with the exception of when I have asked this in a group of students or conferences in Mexico, and basically they say any of these even before they even see what others have said, except probably the only thing that is not there, that is always appearing in these comments, is corruption, which is somehow in this discussion about the institutions and all that. But even though that's important, I don't think that can explain the pattern of growth in Mexico, because it's not that the society has become more corrupt after 1981. It was probably even more corrupt before that. But anyway, from all these discussions that I have just mentioned, I think there are a few factors which really don't make too much sense to be really important. And what I'm trying to do, as you can see, is trying to take in the discussion that as it is now. I'm not yet saying what my position is. Just taking all these issues having put in the table by all these economists and seeing which of those arguments make sense, and I mean which of those are relevant. So I could get rid of some of these. For example, the China factor. China factor is fine. I mean, it's true, has affected Mexican goods which are competing against Chinese products in the U.S. market. But if anything, that's important only after 2001, which is when China entered into the WTO. Before that, China was not even into the agenda in Mexico. I mean, China was not basically exporting that much to the U.S. or to anywhere else, for that matter. So it's not that important. And Hanson has some interesting analysis on what would have happened if China had not entered into the WTO and so on. And the numbers he gets are really, really, really small. I mean, the factor, the impact that China had in Mexico's trade is somewhat important, but it's not that relevant. Not that relevant at least in terms of GDP. So China factor can be discarded. I mean, it's probably important. In some sense, it's good to take that into account, but it's not relevant to explain this three-decade period of stagnation that we are trying to understand here. I will also discard this informality argument because of what Hegman said. I mean, in this paper, which I really buy this argument, that it doesn't make any sense to think that informality affects productivity as a cause, but rather to think that informality is a consequence of low productivity. So, and there are also some results on a recent paper which more or less support this idea that informality is not that important. And it's more a cause rather than a consequence rather than a cause. I don't think labor market rigidity, which is something that some other authors, if you remember, emphasize a lot. And labor market rigidity, which is something, it's an item in the agenda that the World Bank has been pushing a lot, which is, the point is, workers have many rights, and is hiring them formally is costly, firing them is also costly, and therefore firms do not decide not to create more jobs. So that's basically the main idea. When I'm talking about labor market rigidity, that's what they say. So what we need to do is to make the labor market more flexible. And making it more flexible is in some ways like moving away from full-time jobs to payments by the hour, to have to file them with a severance payment, things like that. Which, as you can imagine, is very hard to do this in some sectors. I mean, in some sectors we have unions which are very strong. So those sectors actually do not accept any move in that direction. That would mean to lose some benefits that they have fight for in decades, and therefore that doesn't make too much sense. I mean, that would create an immediate confrontation with these sectors. But other than that, I don't think that's true. I mean, besides the fact that I think it's quite difficult to implement in political terms, it's also very hard to believe that that's important, and let me show you why. If labor market rigidity were an important argument, one thing you would observe, I think, is that for example, during a crisis, like a recent one that we went through, if that argument were correct, you should observe like a small contraction in the number of formal jobs in Mexico. And if it's hard to create new jobs, when the economy started to recover, you would observe relatively small creation of jobs, because it's costly. That's what they are saying. The argument goes, it's costly to hire, it's costly to fire. So jobs should not react that much to the business cycle in general. So if the economy goes down, they shouldn't fire that many workers, because it's costly to do it. If the economy goes up, they shouldn't create that, business shouldn't create that many jobs, because it's costly to do that. So it should be like more stable jobs related to the business cycle in general. But what you see is not that. Let me just show you a little bit of. This is formal jobs. These are total formal jobs in Mexico. First of all, see what has happened from 1994 to 2010, which is the latest data. The total jobs are here. Total formal jobs have gone from 10 million to 15 million in this period, this 15-year period. This is since NAFTA was enacted. That means that in this 15-year period, Mexico has created 5 million formal jobs, which is 50% of the total formal jobs that we had in 1994. So we have created a lot of jobs. So it is not that creation of formal jobs is the problem. I mean, we have created a lot of jobs in these past 15 years. This is one thing you should look at. Second, look at the cycles. I mean, doesn't look like it's quite stable. On the contrary, it looks quite it's moving a lot with the total activity. And let me show you that. Here, what you see here is the green line over here is economic activity in Mexico. The red line and this other line over here are formal jobs. What you observe basically is that they move together. When the economy contracts, total formal jobs contract. When the economy expands, total formal jobs expand. When the stagnation in jobs and in the economy. Expansion in both. So, and this is the recent contraction over here. So, it is not that the creation of jobs is not a problem. So, it's the kind of jobs that we are creating is the problem. So, so that's why I rule out